Hi everyone, this PowerPoint is a short overview of the foreign policy of the Nixon administration. It's interesting, Nixon tends to be better remembered for his foreign policy than his domestic policy, and while he had some important foreign policy achievements, I would argue that his administration actually accomplished more in terms of domestic policy, but it tends to be overshadowed by the Watergate scandal that led to Nixon's resignation. So I'm going to emphasize just a couple things with regard to Nixon's foreign policy for our purposes. One, his efforts to improve relations with the Soviet Union, the policy of détente, as it was called, and Nixon's overtures to China and his stunning visit to China in 1972, which started the process of opening a relationship and a dialogue with China, which eventually led to official diplomatic relations by the time of the presidency of Jimmy Carter. And in between, I'll say just a couple things about the tragic shootings at Kent State University in May 1970, which had a connection to foreign policy of the Nixon administration too. So let's take a quick look at this. The person who worked most closely with Richard Nixon in formulating the administration's foreign policies was his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger had been a lecturer in international relations and history at Harvard University, an ambitious person who was interested in a career in government of a high-level sort, and Nixon tapped him to be national security advisor. This is an important transition in American history in that Nixon very much overshadowed Nixon's Secretary of State. And Nixon was a person who didn't really trust the State Department and wanted to control, direct, shape, formulate foreign policy from the White House. And his administration really did that. But he worked closely with Kissinger, and Kissinger's appointment really elevates the position of National Security Advisor, which is one that had been created at the beginning of the Cold War, back during the administration of Harry Truman, but national security advisors had never been as prominent or as visible to the public as Henry Kissinger was going to become. They both shared a fondness for secrecy, dramatic surprises, and they had a similar view of the world in that they agreed that the United States needed to improve relations with the Soviet Union and begin the process of opening a dialogue with China. So they shared those common goals and formed an effective partnership, even though, as I say, they were extremely different personality types. We didn't really talk about, because falling behind and time constraints, the war in Vietnam. I want to mention it briefly in connection with the tragic shootings of students at Kent State University in May of 1970. Nixon inherited the Vietnam War, which had become extremely unpopular with the American public, and Nixon recognized that direct American involvement needed to be ended. But he wanted to do it in a way that didn't look like a defeat, which was a concept which many Americans agreed. Unfortunately, this was going to end up dragging out the Vietnam War for 5 more long years. In fact, more Americans would die in Vietnam during Nixon's presidency than the 2 previous presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, combined. Nixon did start the process of scaling back direct American involvement with troop withdrawals, but in 1970, he sent American troops into the neighboring country of Cambodia next to Vietnam, where North Vietnamese forces that the United States were fighting against had used remote parts of Cambodian territory for supply bases. And this seemed to many critics of the war to be a dangerous expansion of the war, and it in particular sparked a renewed round of protest on college campuses at the time. And those demonstrations took a tragic turn at Kent State University, a small liberal arts school in Ohio. In May of 1970, the governor there had brought National Guardsmen to the campus after a number of large student protests. And for reasons that have never been sufficiently explained, despite several investigations, a group of these National Guardsmen, so it's not the whole outfit, but a contingent within this guard unit, without warning, opened fire on students after the conclusion of a student rally. This happened during finals week, actually, early May 1970. 4 students were killed, 9 wounded, and this was an event that really shocked the American public. And this photograph that I have here of a young teenage runaway, actually Marianne Del Vecchio, kneeling over the body of a student she had gotten to know named Jeff Miller. This became probably the iconic image of what happened at Kent State. I mentioned she was a runaway. Her parents didn't even know where she was until this photo was reproduced in newspapers and magazines across the country. So the Kent State shootings highlighted the problems with Nixon's approach to ending the Vietnam War, which he was not going to get the United States fully extricated until early 1973. Much more successful were Nixon's policies with regard to the Soviet Union. Détente, this French term, French is the official language of diplomacy, term that means an easing of relations. And Nixon, who was an ardent Cold War politician, had a series of successful meetings with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, and they were able to sign a number of lucrative trade deals, including a number of sales of American grain and wheat to the Soviet Union after the Soviets had these series of disastrous harvests in the 70s. These were very popular with American farmers. And also noteworthy, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the important ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, in 1972, first treaty to place limits on categories of nuclear weapons. And the administration of Ronald Reagan would build on this in Reagan's second term in reaching further agreements with the Soviet Union. Also noteworthy, as I mentioned, was Nixon's surprise visit to China in 1972. China was a nation that became embroiled in a civil war after the end of the Second World War, with 2 major factions, the nationalists and the communists, fighting against one another, with the United States supporting nationalist forces. The communists prevailed. Mao Zedong became the leader of communist government in mainland China. The nationalist forces and nationalist government were driven offshore to the island of Taiwan. And from that point on, that happened in 1949, through the 50s and the 1960s, the United States refused to recognize the communist Chinese government. We only recognized officially the nationalist government on Taiwan. We had no diplomatic relationship with China. And the Nixon administration decided that this really needed to be changed. So Nixon made the surprise announcement that he was going to China. As I note here on the slide, is the first American president to go there since Ulysses Grant in 1878. So this really was a huge event. Had meetings with Chairman Mao, who by this time was much older and in poor health, hadn't even been seen in public for quite some time before Nixon's visit. And this was all televised here in the U.S., so the scenes like that, Nixon walking the Great Wall, these were images of China that Americans hadn't seen for decades. So while there was no single huge breakthrough as a result of this trip. It was an important step in easing relations, opening dialogue, and would lead to the recognition of China and the establishment of official diplomatic relations with China under the presidency of Jimmy Carter in the early 1980s. So these were important steps by the Nixon administration, and his approach to the Soviet Union, approach to China, both of these are important accomplishments from the Nixon administration.